Hi guys, welcome to my channel, Guiding Arrow. This is Tom. I'm at the beach today. It's a little cold, but it's nice out. And just to hear the waves crashing is soothing. Today's video is going to be about the planet Mars. And you might think, well, why is he doing a video about the planet Mars at the beach? Because Mars is supposed to be the planet of fire and war and aggression, right? Well, that's the kind of story I want to complicate today. Present to you some of the linguistic facts, some of the mythologies, and some of my general ideas and intuitions about the planet Mars and how we can expand our definition of this planet and everything it represents. So let's start with the birth of Mars. The story of the birth of Mars isn't a huge myth, unlike the myth of the birth of Venus or the birth of Athena. That might be because in different religions and across different cultures, we have different stories about how Mars came to be. In the Greco-Roman tradition, for example, there was a certain mythology created about Mars that he, in fact, was the son of Hera, and Hera alone. And this happened because Hera was jealous, or she wanted to imitate Zeus after Zeus had Athena without her help. So in this mythology, in this version of the myth, Mars becomes the masculine form of Athena. And Mars represents the birth of this warlike, strong god of power and masculinity derived from the pure feminine. So while that myth isn't hugely popular across history books and across anthologies of myth, it does show you that there is something more to explore about this Mars guy. And it does point to the fact that since Hera is the queen of heaven, and since a lot of archaeologists and a lot of historians about ancient history maintain that the first religions and the first cults were devoted to the feminine worship, the myth of Mars being born of Hera alone shows you that his story and the figure of Mars itself could be derived from a much more ancient myth, something that we don't really understand at this point. So there's actually a more prominent and a more detailed explanation of the birth of Mars if we look to the Indian traditions. I believe this one's derived from more of a South Indian tradition, and it's more prominent in Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken. But this would be a story called The Birth of Kumara, or Kumara Sambhava. So in the Kumara Sambhava, the story starts with a portrait of Shiva. Shiva, the fierce god with matted hair, and he kind of had a bad reputation amongst all the other gods, and he was, kind of cantankerous and aggressive himself. And the story follows that the world, that the gods, that the stars, the sun, and the moon were all troubled by this gigantic monster called the Tarakasura. And this gigantic monster was causing everything on Earth to go haywire, and in the heavens alike. So all of the gods had to bow down to this Tarakasura, this demon Taraka, and they didn't know what to do. So they came to Shiva, and they found a prophecy that said that the only person, the only being who's going to be able to defeat this demon, the Tarakasura, will be born of Shiva. So this led to some difficulties and some shenanigans, because Shiva was in a period he was being a hermit. He did not want to procreate. He was he was cast inwards, he was receded into himself, and he was meditating, and he was in a period of abstention. So the story goes on and goes on to describe the events around this event and how Kumara Sambhava the birth of Mars eventually came to be. And so they eventually had to send the god of desire, who in the Indian tradition goes by Kama, but in the Western Greco-Roman tradition he would be called Eros, or maybe Liber. Oh, no, sorry, Liber would be Dionysus, Eros or Amor. And so when Kama came to Shiva and he tried to shoot his arrow of desire directly at Shiva, Shiva's eyes opened up and his third eye opened up, and Shiva burnt Kama to a crisp as Kama was trying to shoot the arrow of desire. And so there's a sad passage about the death of Kama, how he was obliterated by the third eye gaze of Shiva. So after that, there are certain scholars who say that this point, this scene in the story represents how when Shiva destroyed Kama, love was actually dispersed throughout the entire universe. So instead of being symbolized solely and concentrated solely in this one figure of the god Kama, love became something that was imbued throughout because this god was destroyed and obliterated at that. So to summarize, eventually, yes, it does work, where Shiva finally works up the desire, finally works up the humility, finally works up the openness to mate with Uma, who, if I'm not mistaken, is actually his daughter, but I think the gods and the whole incest things, we see that happen a lot. Anyway, the story ends, at least the version I read. In the version I read, the story ends before the birth of Mars actually happens. But we believe and we see through the context that the birth of Mars, through Shiva and through Uma, happened in order to save the world. So these are two interesting stories about the birth of Mars. And the question arises of, how did we get to our modern day astrological definition of Mars? You ask any astrologer, most of them will say, well, Mars is difficult, Mars is aggressive. If you've got a prominent Mars in your chart, you're going to be angry. On the flip side, they will give Mars credit as being a motivator, as being athletic, as being driven, as being fiery in a good sense, of having a good instinct. And none of this is necessarily incorrect, but it's narrow. And there's so much in the form of linguistic truth and mythical truth and so much symbolism that alludes to something greater about the myth of Mars. Mars is not just a soldier. Mars is not just a guy who wants to see people torn apart and destroyed. Mars becomes a figure that is a little bit misunderstood. So where am I getting all this? Well, first of all, my approach to seeing how Mars has a greater myth and a greater significance to the planetary hierarchy in general is that Mars's name, Mars, is so similar to the word for ocean in various languages, especially the Indo-European languages. Take French la mer, or Italian la mare. In Spanish it's something similar, la mare. And this is from whence we derive the words in English maritime. But then this word also relates to martial. So at once Mars is both a maritime figure and he's also a martial figure. And I'm going to explain to you how that makes sense, especially given the way the myth survived through ancient periods until now. So the first point is that Mars is the god of war. Okay, that's well established. But he wasn't the only god of war. There was Inanna, Ishtar, Athena, Others I can't really think of right now, but so many different gods of war existed all throughout the ancient world. And when we think about how people went to war in those days and what war meant to those people, we have to understand there's a difference between their definition of war way back then and our definition of war now. Okay? Me, born in 92, I grew up seeing war as chemical warfare, as huge weapons that obliterated people. I mean, ever since, Fukushima, or, no, that's the nuclear explosion. When the US dropped a huge bomb on Japan, that was a defining moment where war became pure carnage. War became not what it was in the ancient world. War became about exerting dominance throughout the world through using weapons of huge mass destruction. So how is that different from the definition of the ancients? Well, number one, they didn't really have bombs back then, as far as I know. And number two, they didn't have the same kind of communications that we do in our day and age. So when ancient peoples went to war, it wasn't necessarily just to exert dominance through violence. The word war and all of its negative connotations might not have been so harsh in the ancient world. Because when you look at accounts of ancient Rome and the martial class and how they were very exalted and how they were, very important in maintaining the integrity of the empire, the Roman Empire, you start to understand that war and the arts of the martial theme in the ancient world were not just about aggression. It was also about diplomacy. It was also about trade. It was about territory, but it was about structure and structuring territories throughout the land in order to respond to Rome as the head of the empire, as the central state. So, when we consider how war was different in the ancient world, we consider that the art of Mars and that the martial themes, and a side note, Mars was huge in Rome. There are so many different iterations of Mars throughout Europe, throughout the ancient world, that show you that Mars was not just what it is today, which is war, aggression, anger, turmoil, carnage. Mars, in certain Druidic traditions, there's evidence that he was actually seen as a healer god. And check out Mars, the Wikipedia page on Mars. I hate recommending Wikipedia, but in this case, it's actually backed up with a lot of citations and a lot of good evidence. And just seeing that Mars was called by so many different names, Mars this, Mars that, a lot of them being Mars the healer, or, Mars the savior. I don't know, I'm making that one up, but check it out and see for yourself. So when we understand that these ancient peoples actually saw Mars as not an enemy, but as their greatest ally, such as the Romans did, then we're faced with this dilemma. Are we just derived as a culture, as a society, a civilization, derived from savages who just worship the art of destroying people and creating blood and carnage? I don't think we were. And there's further evidence to prove my point. Number one on that list to show that Mars is more of a positive figure to these people is that Mars was the guardian of snakes and dragons. And there's a lot of mention of snakes and dragons in ancient world and ancient myth. There's snakes and dragons that were considered to be the enemies, such as the python that Apollo slayed. And there are also snakes and dragons that were considered to be sacred. such as the snake that lived under the Acropolis of Athens. And they fed that snake every day. They fed it a honey cake. And the one day that the snake refused to eat the honey cake, that's when they knew that they were about to be invaded by Persians. So snakes were mystical in the ancient world. They were considered mystical, almost portals or embodiments of signals and signs in the greater, unseen in the world. And that's why people could divine with them. They could make prophecies from snakes. But also snakes were seen as threatening because they could take on so much power. The hugeness of a gigantic snake and a sea monster. And that brings up another point. When we think about sea monsters, in the ancient world, the sea monsters are so often depicted as snake-like, right? And so if we connect the word Mars to mare, which means sea, to the snake-like monsters, that they weren't really depicted as fish. They were more serpents, sea serpents, such as in the myth of Perseus and Andromeda. Perseus is saving Andromeda from this gigantic sea serpent. So this sea serpent would have been sacred to Mars. And this also brings up how Mars is also a guardian of the feminine energies. Because when we think about these serpents and these snakes and these scary evil creatures and monsters back in the day, they were often associated with the earth. They were akin to the earth. They were one with the earth or the sea. And in the case of the myth of Apollo slaying the python, a lot of scholars have said that this python would have been an older deity, a chthonic deity, they call it. So, and even when we bring up the word chthonic, which means a deity kind of inhabiting under the earth, or a deity of the earth, but of the subterranean realms, of the kind of rocky underneath portion of the earth. That's what chthonic means, and we inevitably think of Pluto, also called Hades. The guy who's supposed to rule over the hellish realm or the afterlife. And so this is a way of connecting Pluto to Mars. To show how this also was seen as something positive in the ancient world, we have to understand that snakes were not just symbolism of Mars, they also were symbolism of Athena, other feminine goddesses from other traditions, as well as even within the Greco-Roman, we have the figure of Asclepius. Asclepius was the healer god. Asclepius was the ultimate healer god and whose temple was the sort of home base or the point of pilgrimage for a lot of people suffering from sickness. And so they would come to the temple of Asclepius and they would fall asleep, and in their dreams they would acquire the solution to their illnesses. So for this reason, whether we find texts or we find evidence that Mars was directly associated with Asclepius, we see through the symbolism shared by both that Mars did in fact have a healing capacity in the ancient world. So that's all lovely and nice, but how does it relate to how we are now? Well, I think we honestly have a huge role in creating our own realities. So when we have the majority of people and the majority of astrologers who say that they've got a key to the secrets of life, and at the same time they are unable to acknowledge Mars as a healing figure, then we lose out on that completely. If you don't understand in your mind that something is possible, then even if you see the evidence of it in text, right in front of your face, in the news, whatever, you're not going to really let that possibility even happen or affect you. So let's see, what have I left out? Oh, well, here's a big point. In addition to the word Mars relating to the word for the sea, mare, we also have in ancient Egyptian a similar word, which is mar, which, it's difficult to translate hieroglyphics in a lot of ways, or transliterate, which means to add, to, take a sign and make it into a letter or a sound. That proves difficult, but it's basically well established that the word mar, or mr, in ancient Egyptian, which inevitably relates to Mars, this word meant seashore. Mar meant seashore. And that's not the only meaning that Mar had in ancient Egyptian. Mar also meant, in ancient Egyptian, Mar meant beloved. And this is why we see so many prominent wives or famous women in ancient Egypt called things like Mary something. Mary Totten, who was the wife of a general during the reign of Akhenaten. Mary Khenefre, things like this. Names like this demonstrate that Mars and the name Mary could be related. And that this beloved participle was very, very prominent in ancient Egypt. And it, leads us to think that maybe the biblical figure of Mary, the Queen of Heaven, who became the Queen of Heaven, could in fact relate to Hera, who was the mother of Mars, and she was the Queen of Heaven herself. So, what kind of new portrait does this give us of Mars? What kind of portrait have I painted of a figure who is seen as so brutal and so aggressive? Well, we can see now that Mars is a guardian spirit. And, I don't know what kind of world you're living in, but in my world, I can see how the Earth, through its weather, through the fury of the ocean, through the skies and storms, Earth is fierce when it comes to protect itself. Earthquakes and tsunamis demonstrate the fierce aspect of Earth. And so, when we think about... Okay, okay, I'm back. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so the reason for violence, the reason for fury, the reason for aggression seems to be the calling card of Mars. And yes, this is about motivation. Yes, this is about fiery insight. Yes, this is about standing up for yourself. It's about knowing what you're standing up for. It's about, defending the feminine, because Mars was created by this feminine energy in order to defeat the demon. In order to set the world aright, Mars has to be created. Sometimes the world can lag and slow, and Mars has to come in and push us forward. And, if that isn't the military, the martial way of being in a nutshell, I don't know what is, So we can see how in certain strata of society, this military or martial instinct is abused and used to bully people. But in our own personal lives, we can neither shy away from it nor overly indulge in it. And so it's about finding the middle ground and finding that respect for ourselves, respect for the earth, respect for where we come from, respect for our feminine allegiances, respect for our feminine energies. And that's much easier said than done. The mysteries are still out there. The mysteries of where we come from and who's out in space and everything these are all mysteries that we are contemplating. So when we become overly martial, when we embody too much of this aggravated energy, we're becoming more of the demon than we are becoming the hero. So Mars is that hero, and Mars as that masculine figure, he defines himself against the demon. He defines himself in opposition to the demon. And so the Martian instinct becomes the instinct to define ourselves in opposition to something that we feel we need to take down. And so Mars can be so extremely powerful because of that emotional process and because of that mental justification of seeing something or someone do wrong. And then that Martian instinct comes in and it shows us how to fight for who we are and fight for what we believe in. And so for that reason, it can be disruptive. But when we call it a malefic, when we call it a planet, that's just bad, then we don't understand the sacredness, and we don't give credit to the ancients who worshipped this guy. Come on! They worship these energies. And in order to turn the bad of Mars into something good, we have to understand the value of worshiping it and finding the worth, which is what I see in the word worship, is finding the value, finding the worth in these energies, and it's also finding the value and the worth in yourself, defending your territory. Not like a vicious dog with rabies, but like a sly, smooth snake who offers wisdom and who offers greater insight to those whom he sees deserve it or whom he sees are ready for it. And, I would say much more, but I'm getting into mysteries that even I don't know about. So I'm going to continue my research. I hope you guys understand and appreciate what I'm saying, and I hope that it casts new light. And so if you see a scary Mars transit happening in your horoscope, you might not think, oh, woe is me, everything's going to burn up in flames. You might think instead to respect this time as you respect the ocean. You respect the scary creatures that live in the ocean, but you also respect the beauty, and you respect the power of water in sustaining life. And to close it, I'll talk about the words of Michael Scott, who, when he was writing his book about astrology, the Liber Introductorius, he mentioned the creation, God's creation as told in the Bible. And he says, we all know that, on the first day, or God said, let there be light. On the first day, he created this, he created that. Well, in Michael Scott's version, he talks about the days of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And so Tuesday, the day of Mars, Marti Die in Latin, on Tuesday, God created the waters. And that was before he created man, before he created creatures. So this energy, this watery energy is primal, it's primeval. And it's something to worship as something greater than us, as mere bodies. So with that, I thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you tune in for the next one. I hope to really shake up your definition about these planets and why you shouldn't necessarily think doom and gloom when Saturn or Mars gets involved in your horoscope, and how to see it with new light, how to learn how to worship it, and to better ourselves as people at the same time. All right, I'm rambling, so bye.